to use the term hostages in their case, not to justify that they were held for 5 years, by no stretch of the imagination, but to use the term hostages is very problematic in the context of which they were operating in southern Colombia. They were there in 2003, 2 years, a year and a half after President Bush already authorized U.S. servicemen and contractors to conduct counterinsurgency, not counter-drug operations. That was in the heart of where the Farc were operating, in Caquetá and in the southern part of the country. So we will never get to the bottom of what exactly these folks were doing down there. Again, not to justify, but I think that's one of the many questions that are left unsaid. And then finally, his last comments there about what Uribe's proposals are, really are optimistic, if not completely naive. He doesn't seem to understand that Uribe's strategy is not to dialogue with the FARC. His intention is to totally dismantle them. He does not recognize them as a belligerent force, and the argument that they're terrorists, which Gonsalves here is arguing, is something that Uribe has embraced to the detriment of any possibility of dialogue for long-lasting peace in Colombia.
Let me turn to Manuel Rozental. Your response right now as a man who has fled Colombia, a physician, a human rights activist, now living in Canada, hearing the description of the FARC and also talking about the Uribe government. It's interesting that Ingrid Betancourt, perhaps the most well-known hostage, who has now returned to France, said she may run for president again, in fact, ran against Uribe. Said Colombian President Alvaro Uribe should soften his tone when dealing with FARC guerrillas. She urged Uribe to break with the language of hatred. Manuel.
Yes. Hi, Amy. It's very interesting. I first of all have to say, like, I think almost every Colombian, that we were absolutely elated by the liberation of Ingrid, and that her condition is good, and one cannot downplay that. Regardless of how it was achieved, it was fantastic that she was released unharmed, and that all the other ones were as well. Also, what Mario was saying, there were really 14 prisoners of war and 1 hostage released. The 14 prisoners of war mistreated, abused, and I'm also glad, as everybody is, that they're free. And in fact, I would say, knowing Ingrid before she was kidnapped, and precisely 2 or 3 days before she was kidnapped by FARC, she actually met with FARC commanders, including Raúl Reyes, and said directly that she demanded a gesture of goodwill from FARC in order for peace to be achieved in Colombia. And her almost exact words were, your gesture of goodwill has to be no more kidnapping in Colombia, and then otherwise, if you don't do that gesture, if you don't carry it out, then Colombia will explode into a spiral of disaster and you will lose all credibility. So I think that background is essential, because just a couple of days after she says that, she's kidnapped by the very people she demands that gesture from. But I think it's very important to put the whole thing into context. First, the Uribe government has peaked in popularity, but also has reached a bottom in terms of illegitimacy. It was condemned just a few days before this operation of liberation was carried out, because of buying out votes from Congress to achieve re-election in a fraudulent way. Uribe's administration is also linked to death squads, and so are the members of the coalition that led him to win the elections twice, and high officials in government, including the secret police. So we're talking about the regime with the worst human rights record in the continent, and the army with the worst human rights record in the continent, with the greatest U.S. support, including the contractors or mercenaries that Mario was talking about. So the fact that this regime was involved in this liberation does not and should not and cannot cover up the fact that it is a horrendous regime. So the main point I'd like to make here, beyond the discussion as to whether FARC or the government, which one is worse or which one is legitimate, the main point here is an SOS for the popular movements and organizations and the people of Colombia, who right now, with the validation of Uribe's regime, are at the greatest risk of continuing to be, or even worsening, the human rights records and abuses. And to put this into perspective, there is a major plan in progress within Colombia and from Colombia with U.S. support and for corporate interests to take over resources and wealth and territories in Colombia, and from there to launch a war or a major conflict in the Andean region. That agenda is going to advance even further after, if Uribe gets away with the legitimation of his regime after the liberation of Ingrid. So to go back to where I started, if Ingrid was the same Ingrid that was kidnapped by Farc, the one that denounced corruption of the government and launched the presidential campaign, she would be saying what I'm saying now. You cannot legitimate a corrupt regime for profit because you have liberated somebody. In fact, the person they've liberated fought against that corruption, and we hope she'll do it again.
I wanted to bring Michael Evans into this discussion, director of the Colombia Documentation Project at the National Security Archive. Interpress Service wrote an interesting piece called Colombia, the General Ingrid Hugged. And they're talking about General Mario Montoya. General Mario Montoya Uribe and Ingrid Betancourt. For our radio listeners, we're showing the image. You can go to our website at democracynow.org. Tell us about this general.
Sure. Thanks for having me on the show. General Mario Montoya is the commander of the Colombian army. And he has a sort of spotted history with respect to human rights. And it's important for the listeners to the show to realize that there's another side to the coin with the FARC. Few people have illusions that the FARC are well-intentioned liberals, but the other side of it are the right-wing paramilitary groups that have operated virtually unhindered in Colombia for decades. Mario Montoya, the general that Ingrid hugged, and I haven't seen the Interpress story, but I can imagine where it goes, just last year was the subject of a CIA report leaked to the Los Angeles Times that implicated him in a joint operation with paramilitary forces in the city of Medellin just a few years ago when he was the commander of an army brigade there. And Montoya, throughout his career, has been dogged by these kinds of allegations. A unit that he was a member of in the late 1970s when he was a young intelligence officer had actually formed a supposedly independent, spontaneous paramilitary group known as the AAA, the American Anti-Communist Alliance, that was responsible for bombings and other kinds of threats and intimidation, sort of black ops type operations in Colombia. The unit that he was associated with created it as a completely clandestine project. So General Montoya has a lot to answer for, as does President Uribe. You know, many of his political allies have been implicated in the parapolitical scandal, a scandal touched off by the discovery of a paramilitary laptop a couple of years ago. So there's another side to this that I think is lost in this and is in danger of sort of being consumed or buried under this sort of all this wave of adoration for you know what is, I think, rightly considered a very successful military operation. Of course, everybody's happy that the hostages have been released, and it's a huge victory for them and their families. But you have to also see this as a huge victory for Uribe and for really as something that's going to help him to get through and sort of avoid addressing some of these larger problems that he faces.
The AAA, what is it, Michael Evans?
Yeah, the AAA was a group, again, that in the late 1970s and early 1980s operated as a clandestine unit of a Colombian military intelligence unit. Essentially, they were formed completely covertly behind the scenes without any attribution to the Colombian army. They were responsible for bombing the Communist Party headquarters and some other acts of intimidation around that time. It's really the first documented evidence